Good. Well, perfect, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. And first of all, Happy New Year. Our first webinar, Royal Artillery Historical Society webinar of 2024. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Major Frank Baldwin, who from the exchanges prior to this to going live, I think Frank knows everybody. So this is it's a fantastic opportunity. The avoidance of doubt, for those that don't know Frank, served as a gunner for 10 years and now a freelance guide, historian and heritage professional. Early supporter of the Guild of Battlefield Tours, and his specializations are mostly Europe, Caesar to the Cold War, with a particular bent on the Napoleonic era, and interested in the mid-19th century wars between Prussia, Austria, France, and also the 7 Years' War. Numerous published works, including 2 books on Normandy and chapters in the British Army Guide of the Western Front. I also note, Frank, that you supported the British Army centenary staff rides, which must have been quite extraordinary, because I know they were on some scale. So we're delighted to welcome you to be our first speaker in 2024's programme. You're going to talk to us tonight about the 17-pounder self-propelled Mark 10. So we very much look forward to hearing from you. Frank, the floor is yours. Frank, you need to unmute, please. Frank, it's John. You need to unmute your microphone. You're on silent.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
We've got you loud and clear. Brilliant.
Lovely.
Over to you.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, John, and welcome everybody. And thank you for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. This is the story of the 17-pounder M10 self-propelled anti-tank gun and the tales of some of the men who serve this equipment. The sources for this I'm using are, apart from some documents and war diaries and so on, there are 2 or 3 histories of some of the units, but there aren't very many. But here's one. Here's an extract from the history of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders 5th Battalion, 91st Anti-Tank Regiment Royal Artillery. The M10 was the Cinderella of armoured fighting vehicles. Many people had never heard of them or seen them. Yet an American officer of wide experience patted one of our 17-pounder SPs and said, "This is the finest self-propelled gun in any army in the world." Every man in the 2 SP batteries in 91st Regiment would agree. The 3-inch M10 was a good SP. The 17-pounder was a terror. I never heard of one failing to knock out any tank it hit. And what I want to talk about is the background to how that equipment came to be adopted by the British Army, a bit of the description of the equipment and how it was used, and then some stories of the men who used it. Now, I'll start with this picture of a German equipment. That's because this is possibly the first self-propelled anti-tank gun in use anywhere. And that's what we sometimes forget, is that the only army that had prior experience of mass tank attacks prior to the Second World War was the Germans. And they found fairly quickly that one of the best remedies was self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. That's a 7.7 centimeter anti-aircraft gun. But they took anti-tank warfare very seriously. After the First World War, most armies adopted something like a small caliber cannon, typically between 25 millimeters and 40 millimeters. And these were guns which would intend to be light enough to be manhandled with the infantry, but would penetrate the kind of tanks which they're expected to meet. The French design dates from about 1924, but actually not deployed until 1934. The German design, 1933, they're set 3.7 centimeters, deployed 1936. And at the bottom, the 40 millimeter 2-pounder British anti-tank gun, designed in 1936, deployed in 1938. And the British 40mm 2-pounder was one of the better designs, but Britain was late into assigning anti-tank guns. The first anti-tank regiments were converted from field brigades as late as 1938. So we hadn't given a lot of thought or much consideration, certainly nothing like the numbers you needed for anti-tank guns. That's largely, I suspect, the parsimoniousness of the Treasury and politics, that basically the army was the Cinderella service in the 1930s, and took second place to the third place, really, the Air Force and the Navy, and the field army came well after air defence of Great Britain. These are the sorts of tanks they thought they'd meet in 1940 to 41, and those anti-tank guns were good enough, but few armies other than the Germans had enough anti-tank guns to be able to cope with the numbers of tanks that the Germans employed, hence the term blitzkrieg. Even though in the 1940, as early as 1940, there were heavier tanks that would resist the projectiles of these lighter anti-tank guns. The British Matilda is top left, British infantry tank, that could not be penetrated by the 3.7 German anti-tank gun, nor could the Russian T-34 from 1940, which the Germans met in 1941. And the photograph at the bottom shows the scarring marks on a T-34 turret of the 3.7 centimeter shells which have bounced off, hence the German nickname the door knocker. So it was obvious that you needed bigger guns, and the British and Germans ended up with something around 5 centimeter, British 57mm, the QF 6-pounder, designed in 1940, but didn't arrive in numbers until 1942. And anybody, if you've read much about the Second World War in Britain, you'll realise that after Dunkirk, priority was given to getting any anti-tank guns rather than retooling the factories to tool up for a gun which wasn't going to repair for a year or so. That's actually quite a good gun, the 6-pounder, and would be continue in service to the end of the war. But even then, it was obvious you'd need something bigger still, because there were stories that the Germans had heavy tanks. And so in April 1941, the decision was made to make a 17-pounder. The origin started sort of mid-April, and what they were after was a gun with a muzzle velocity about 3,000 feet per second, would penetrate 125 millimeters of armor at 600 yards, split trail, 60 degrees of traverse, top traverse, with a weight of 2.5 tons. As it was built, and I think the first prototype was built, they produce a wooden mock-up by August 1941 and order it straight into production. And as built, the MV is about right, give or take 100 feet per second, but it weighed 3 tons. And the image is that on the bottom are there really just to show the size of this beast. And tactically, it would take around about it would take about 12 hours to dig in the gun down to sort of muzzle, get the muzzle down to ground level, and provide protection for the crew. It gets nicknamed as coastal artillery by the people who use the self-propelled guns. So 17-pounder, but it's a good gun. It would knock out any German tank. And by the beginning of 1944, it's obvious you're going to need these in huge numbers, because this is the kind of tanks which the British thought that they would engage in Normandy. As it happens, the bottom one, the Ferdinand, doesn't appear. This is a picture from the Royal Artillery Training Memorandum from early 1944, but that's what the 17-pounders intended to defeat. What am I doing next? Here we go. Here, this is the figures in comparison. And this shows, this is a slightly busy slide here, but what you're showing at the top is the probability of a first round hit at different ranges. And then below it is the penetration APC-BC is armor piercing capped with a ballistic cap, which is the standard anti-armor round, armor piercing round. But the British also developed a discarding sabot, which is the predecessor of all modern tank ammunition. I'll explain the sabot principle afterwards for anyone who needs it. But this is a way of getting even greater penetration, but at a reduction of accuracy. And the APDS, though, the 6-pounder, and I've got a comparison here of the 17-pounder and the 6-pounder. The APDS round comes in for the 6-pounder just in time for D-Day, but for the 17-pounder, it doesn't appear until the end of 1944. They're still sort of demonstrating it to units in the beginning of 1945. The probability of the first round hit, this comes from an operation research study, and the key issue here is range estimation. If you get the range wrong, you're going to miss the target. And obviously, if you're talking about engaging tanks at 1,500 yards plus, a mile plus away, you need to hit first time, because the Germans are very good at their optics and range finding. I'll just comment on that in a minute. The significant piece about the 6-pounder from the point of view of the big picture is that I've put little silhouettes at the sort of an approximation of the range at which these things could knock them out. And as you can see, the 6-pounder with discarding sabot is quite effective, but without the discarding sabot, and there's only a special issue of that, it's not standard ammunition. Without it, it can't do any effect on the heavier German tanks, the Panthers and the Tigers that they're expecting. So the pressure is on the 17-pounders to do the work. Just showing. This is the British Army's range estimation, and you can see there's the #1 with his Mark 1 eyeball and field and binoculars trying to estimate the ranges of the targets trying to hit in the far wood line, which is about a mile away. By contrast, the Germans are already into the business of having stereoscopic rangefinders. This is the German top piece of German anti-tank equipment that is in its wheeled form, top right, is every bit as big and awkward as the 17-pounder, and the Germans have exactly the same problems as the Brits do with those in terms of concealment. But they are dotted around. They're the things you find in some of the bunkers that are still there on the D-Day beaches. And on the left-hand side, there are two of the German big beasts that mount this thing. This is the 8.8 centimeter Pak 43 L71 and 71 calibers long in the Jagdpanther and the King Tiger. And if you look at down here, these are the accuracies. I don't need to point about penetration. This will hit, if it hits any British tank up to about 3,000 yards, it would knock it out. And you can see that the figures underneath, they quote different figures, training and action. But they have an early stereoscopic rangefinder. This is the EM009MR rangefinder, and that's actually fitted so you could get a good first round shot in from these. And so, you know, these are claiming twice the accuracy of British guns, and it's because of the fire control equipment. Whether or not the Germans actually achieved that with the rangefinders, I don't know, because what I've read is these things only work for some people. It's stereoscopic, not everybody has stereoscopic vision, and they never got the people together to train them properly to use them. But that's if you like, those are the numbers which I found on this. Back to the 17-pounder. Big problem with the 17-pounder is how do you get it into the forward area? The forward area where you're going to encounter fragments from mortar rounds, shell rounds, odd bullets, and so on. The field artillery tractor, the quad, top left-hand corner, I've particularly selected that picture just to emphasize the reasons why nobody liked using it. It was immensely vulnerable. You've got a quad petrol tanks and stuff full of propellant, cordite and so on in the for the 17-pounder, and that makes it incredibly dangerous and a risky proposition to use in the forward areas. That's on the rear slopes of Hill 113 in Normandy. The gunners looked at this in 1943 when the 17-pounder first came out. It was available from really the end of 1942, beginning of 1943. It's first used in North Africa. But they looked even then, they knew that the field artillery tractor wasn't the right answer. Do you see my pointer here? Just a matter of interest. Can you see? Do I see a pointer there? No? Okay, obviously not. Top right-hand side is the M2 Scout car and the M3 half-track. The RATM from spring 1943 says we've tried this stuff. These are too underpowered to act as gun tractors for the 3-ton beast. The later versions of the half-track, the M14 that they give to the Brits in 1944, has got more powerful engine, and that ends up by being the gun tractor for the anti-tank regiments in the armoured divisions, and is used after the Second World War with those units that retain the 17-pounder, the towed 17-pounder. The other thing they go for is the idea of using the Crusader gun tractor. This is the bottom right. And these are obsolescent Crusader tanks. Take the turret off and put a lightly armoured box around it, and that will tow a 17-pounder. Absolutely great piece of kit for the gunners. It was by this time the Crusader was a fairly reliable tank. Although I think one of the issues is you put a gunner in charge of something which will go 50 miles an hour, and that's substantially faster than it's supposed to tow a 17-pounder. And so this is there are lots of missives going out telling people not to exceed the speed limits with these things. But you can imagine what gunners will do if given a chance to cabby these. However, the big problem with this is the total configuration is over 60 feet long. And that is a real problem around, say, for example, the narrow lanes of England or Normandy, for that matter, or indeed Italian villages. So this is far from ideal, but this is the equipment which is used for the core anti-tank regiments. The Canadians do it slightly differently. They use their own ram tanks, turretless ram tanks, which also end up by being used as armoured personnel carriers. Indeed, by the end of the war, the towed self-propelled the towed heavy anti-tank guns, there's little use for them. They're hardly ever engaged, and the infantry, the gunners get used as infantry, and the tractors get used as armoured personnel carriers. I'm not sure the Crusader is, but the Canadian Rams are used as the armoured personnel carriers for some of the attacks around the Reichswald and in the autumn and winter 44-45 and thereafter. Okay. Now here's the British self-propelled gun experience. As early as 1940, the post-Dunkirk Bartholomew Review concluded that a proportion of we needed more anti-tank guns, and a proportion of them should be self-propelled. However, that was pretty well down the shopping list after Dunkirk. However, the idea of putting a 2-pounder on the back of a 1,500 weight truck was an easy way of getting mobility, and also a way of getting a gun into action fairly quickly. On the top left, the 2-pounder Portee. Its problem, of course, is it's incredibly vulnerable, and as demonstrated by the heroism of Ward Gun of J Battery at Sidi Rezai. It's very vulnerable, and to use one of those under fire is obviously an act of a brave man. When the 6-pounder came in, they thought they'd have a 6-pounder Portee, but that fitted on the back of a 3-tonner. And as you can see from the picture below, which is taken on exercise Spartan, you've got a vehicle which has all the manoeuvrability and ease of concealment of a 3-ton truck. And the Deacon, which is a 6-pounder in an armoured box on the back of a Bedford, also is less than ideal as a self-propelled anti-tank gun, though they do have their moment of glory, and they get a bit of a mention in the RA commemorative book for chasing tanks in Tunisia. But my reading of it is the Germans were on the run at that time and didn't want to stop for a fight. But that's the British self-propelled equipment. Not great. The British do have two diversions into tracked self-propelled guns. This one on the top left is the 1925 development, the Birch gun, and this mounts a 12-pounder gun, self-propelled on the top of a medium tank chassis, and this is part of the Experimental Armoured Brigade or Mechanised Brigade in the manoeuvres in the late 1920s. The comment at the bottom is taken from Jonathan Bailey's book on firepower and quotes what the gunner's response to this was at the end. I think this is also tailored to a bit of a turf war that was going on between the gunners and the Royal Armoured Corps at that time, or rather a Royal Tank Regiment, with some unhelpful comments by the armoured enthusiasts that it was time for the Royal Horse Artillery to be renamed the Royal Tank Artillery and part across to become part of the Royal Armoured Corps or become part of the Tank Corps. And this wasn't this is an area where the gunners and Royal Armoured Corps have what the Americans call food fights and turf wars over who owns it and who designs it and who operates it. What is notable about this is that the comments about the Birch gun was that as a close support weapon, which is what they were trialling, the 18-pounder wasn't that good because it's a gun and not a howitzer, therefore less effective for close support of infantry and armour in mechanised operations. However, an 18-pounder self-propelled gun has a muzzle velocity over 2,000 feet per second. It would have punched a hole in any tank up to about 1942. And really, they had the macings of what would have been quite a good self-propelled anti-tank gun if they thought they needed one. But that's those had all been gone by the Second World War. What we're looking at the right here is a development which I think is also coming together of minds in the Royal Armoured Corps and the Royal Artillery. The Royal Armoured Corps in about April 1941 think, well, we're developing this new heavy tank, the Churchill, and I think also it would be quite handy to see if we could fit some of the obsolescent 3-inch 20 hundredweight anti-aircraft guns, World War I vintage, into the Churchill tank, because that would be a heavy support tank to go along with the Churchill. And at this point, the Churchill was a highly unreliable vehicle and wouldn't really come into any reliability in about 1942. And this was seen as a comment underneath it, a temporary expedient to deal with any super heavy tanks, and should be used until the 17-pounder anti-tank guns issue. Now, this is actually not a million miles away from the American solution and what the M10 tank destroyer has, which is the Americans' own 1918 vintage anti-aircraft gun. The Royal Artillery input into this was from the then Commander Home Forces, Alan Brooke, General A.F. Brooke at that time, who as Commander Home Forces was very dissatisfied with the state of anti-tank defences. His diary notes with deep dissatisfaction and unsatisfactory demonstration of anti-tank equipment in May 1941. And he is very much behind the idea of retaining 100 of these, there's about 1,000 surplus 3-inch 20 hundredweight anti-aircraft guns coming out of service, because they're being replaced by the 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun, which is much better. A lot of these end up by going to merchant ships or shipped to Russia, but we retain 100 of them, of which 50 will go into this Carrier Churchill 3-inch gun, Mark I, and 50 will be mounted on field carriages. And that actually would have been a fairly decent anti-tank gun for 1941-42, but they're never really used and never shipped in any numbers over to the Mediterranean. This beast, though, the Carrier Churchill 3-inch, does get manufactured. The 25 are issued to each of, I think it's not 25, 24 are issued to armored infantry or heavy tank brigades in Home Forces, with the idea, with 12 to each of 2 heavy tank brigades, with the idea, and they weren't issued with any crew, but that's something which the Churchill equipped brigades were supposed to find some crews for them from somewhere, and these would provide heavier fire than the 2-pounders which the Churchill was initially equipped with. And that none of these ever go into action. And by 1943, I mean, when I say 1942, the first of these appears in November 1942, and so they're kind of redundant, and I think their main use becomes as tank hulks on ranges. I think there's one at Lulworth, but I haven't seen it. Right, that's the British attempts. Now we move across the Atlantic, and the Americans. I start here with the tank destroyer branch, because the tank destroyer branch is the Americans' approach. In 1940, the American army was very worried and thought they were going to get involved in World War II, and they were very worried about the German blitzkrieg, and their interpretation, having seen some neutrals along to see it and observers, was that the floods of German tanks overran the French, and so their idea, General Marshall, having looked around for which branch of the US services was going to handle the problem of dealing with anti-tank, and anti-tank, neither infantry, artillery, or cavalry wanted to get involved in it. So they formed a new branch of their army called the tank destroyers. And the tank destroyers were supposed to provide a very aggressive approach to enemy armor, that if a German panzer thrust burst through, they were going to be headed off by extremely mobile anti-tank guns, which set up effectively counter-penetration and anti-tank ambushes. And the equipments which they used, to the right, is something not a million miles away from a 2-pounder Porty, is an American 37mm gun on the back of a Dodge truck. Bottom left is the M3 gun motor carriage, which mounts First World War vintage French 75mm gun on the back of a half-track. Neither of those is ideal. The only thing that came close to what they wanted was this thing here on the right. The experimental vehicle is called the T-35 gun motor carriage, and this is a Sherman tank chassis. But holding a 3-inch 1918 vintage anti-aircraft gun, updated. And they said, well, this wasn't ideal for what that's what the prototype looks like. This is what they actually look like, the two on the left here. And it goes into service the M10 gun motor carriage, 3-inch M7 gun. Now, this is an interim tank destroyer because the tank destroyer board aren't really that happy with it. It's a little bit faster than a Sherman tank. It's a lot less armored, and it's got a gun which is a bit bigger than the 75mm in the Sherman. But what they really wanted was the vehicle on the right, which comes into service eventually as the M18 gun motor carriage, which was supposed to be the fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle around at the time. Even lighter armor than the M10, but with a newer 76mm gun, the same 76mm gun that eventually goes to the Sherman tank and is armed the tank that you'd see in Fury. But this doesn't come into service until 1944, and when it does come into service, the men of the tank destroyer arm aren't that keen on it because it's even less armoured than the M10, which they've got used to, and actually, who needs to travel at 40 miles an hour around a battlefield? And so they were actually less keen. It doesn't have a lot of space in the turret either. But this is the M10. Good stuff about the M10. It's based on the M4 Sherman, which means it's very reliable. And actually, as a piece of design, it's a really good design. It's designed to be used by not particularly mechanically adept American teenagers. It's very easy on, I'm talking to one of the people who does the reconstructions of these. This is a vehicle which you can mishandle the gears without breaking them. And if you do break the transmission, all your final drives, the steering and the gears are the bit at the very front of the tank, and with a couple of bolts you can take it off and fix it. And it's an incredibly reliable vehicle, which is kind of the starting point for any vehicle. You want one which is reliable. And this goes into service to the American tank destroyer arm, and they're offered it to the British, and the British say, yes, please. And we take 1,600 of these. all of them initially with the 3-inch M7 gun. Have I missed anything out here? When we look in the top of it, this is the back and the top here. What you have got, this, you can see the sort of space that's in here. Oh, it's numbered, so I can talk to stuff. Note, here's some bits here. If you look at number 5 on the top hand right hand side, you can see that they're very thoughtfully provided it with a dial sight. The tank destroyer arm was set up by artillerymen, and they thought, well, if it's a gun, we might want to use it in the indirect role. You know, it'd be boring to say we'll only use it for anti-tank. So they come fitted with a dial sight. What the Americans, I think it's a panoramic sight, but it has a bracket from which you could actually fit a dial sight. If you come round to number 7, it has an open top. If you look around number 7 on halfway up the right-hand side, number 7 shows it's got a little sticky out bit. Those are arms for something you can erect a tent over the top to protect you from the rain. You know, this is thoughtful stuff. The back of it, number 8, on all of the M10s, you'll see them, they have the back sticks out quite far. And it also has, you can't see on in here, an M2 .5 caliber Browning heavy machine gun. The reason for that is not just anti-aircraft defense, but it's also a counterweight, because the weight of the barrel, it's unbalanced, and it needs a balance at the back of the turret. Otherwise, on any kind of slope, it would be very difficult to traverse the turret uphill. And this has a manual traverse, unlike the Sherman, the M4 Sherman, which has a power traverse. They did fit it eventually as an experiment, but they decided they've made most of them now, so they weren't going to continue with the experiment. It comes in 2 flavors of engine. They were actually made on the same production lines as the M4 Sherman. You have 2 flavors of engine. You either have a petrol engine or a diesel engine. The General Motors diesel engine, they're actually a pair of diesel engines in the back, giving, I think, around about 375 brake horsepower. A pair of diesel engines. There is no charging engine on the M10, and this is a significant drawback, in that if you roll up to the infantry and spend some time in the position while you're waiting for the tow guns to come forwards, you could run out of battery. You run the batteries flat, because the infantry aren't going to be happy with the thumping away of diesels in the night and so on, and they weren't. And what they discovered quite early on is that the tactical tow start is quite a significant feature that you have to be aware of. One thing I've noticed after doing a bit of research on this is almost every picture of an M10, you'll see it with its tow chain. You don't have to use a tow chain. One of the fellows who wrote about his experience in Normandy, a man called John Hall, one of his M10s broke down, or rather couldn't run out of, the batteries were flat, and so he got another one to push start it, and that seemed to work. So that's the M10. I was going to say anything else about that. No charging, I mentioned. Yeah, it's got a manual traverse. It takes about 2 minutes to traverse 180 degrees, and it's supposed to travel. You're not supposed to travel with this gun, with the gun forwards. You're actually supposed to have the gun in the reverse position over the engine deck, and there's a clamp that holds it in place so you don't shake it out of true as you travel. But lots of pictures with them, you'd see them in the forward areas. Obviously, if it takes 2 minutes to bring the gun in the pointing the right way, they put the gun traversed forwards. It's only really for long road moves that they don't. Yeah, we've got here, this covers the bit here. You can see here, this is a picture of the M10. These M10s in British service, the British decided, well, this is pretty good, but wouldn't it be even better if we could fit a 17-pounder in it? Because this would solve the problem of moving the 17-pounder around. At the same time, they're struggling with fitting a 17-pounder in the Sherman. And if you look up how the Sherman Firefly, the development of that, is quite tortuous. They have to do quite a lot of butchery on the gun to get it to fit. Much easier for the M10, because one of the helpful things that the designers did was they actually made it easy to upgrade the gun. They had an idea that this might be fitted with the 3-inch American gun, but they might want to upgrade it to something else, maybe a 105mm howitzer, maybe a 90mm anti-aircraft gun, which incidentally is what the Americans eventually do. They take the same M10s and they convert them to what is called the M36, which is a 90mm anti-tank gun. It's America's standard heavy anti-aircraft gun, and that has a pretty good anti-armor performance, as good as the 17-pounder without discarding SAB ammunition. This view here, there's quite a lot of thought also given to things like crew storage. All of this is kind of designed and standardized. You can see here the M2 machine gun at the rear of the turret, and also the weight. Their weights go through various versions. Some of them, the start of it's just 2 lead weights that they stick on the back, and eventually they design, and that's called the duck bill. This thing is one other thing about this thing, if you had to use it on, is it's got sloped sides, so it's damn difficult to climb up the side. And there's even a piece in the user manual showing you how to mount the vehicle from the front. How about I said anything there? That's good in that bit. Now, the British thought this was great, and they discovered that they could mount their 17-pounders in it. Eventually, Britain will mount about 1,000 17-pounders in the M10s. Not all of the versions were easy to convert, but we mount about 1,000. And this, as I mentioned earlier, this is absolutely seen as one of the key pieces of equipment that is needed to complement everything else to go to Normandy, where you might have to face big German tanks. Unfortunately, we only had 24 ready by D-Day. This is the Parham Papers. There's a note in the Parham Papers. Parham was the Brigadier Royal Artillery of the Second Army, to say that it was industrial action that was stopping slowing the production down. That eventually clears, and there's a rolling process to upgrade the M10. And there's a whole thing about naming it. If you look at a lot of the literature, the modern post-war literature and kits and things like that, he's given the name Achilles. That's not a name that was used in the Second World War any more than Wolverine was the name for the M10. They weren't. They were called, it was a 17-pounder SP. And sometimes the MT was, these were known as M10C, in the same way that the Sherman would be a Sherman 5C to indicate that it was a Firefly and 17-pounder armed. So in some of the units referred to them as Mayflies, rather similar to the Fireflies. And during the course of the campaign in Northwest Europe, it goes from having 24 to about 800 of these in service. It isn't always clear which version of the M10 is used in the actions, and I think the comment by Dennis Flower at the beginning, the first, on its own, the M10's not a bad anti-tank gun, but if you've got one of these, it's really brilliant. This shows the arrangement plan. This is from, actually, it's all courtesy of Bovington, has got all the details on this thing. This is the arrangement plan for mounting, and I said it's a simple process, but if you look at all the bits that have to be done, even a simple process requires quite a lot of changes to be made. This is the ammunition bit that does damage. If you look on the right-hand side, I've just taken a picture because there isn't one specifically for the M10 17-pounder. This is Firefly. The armor, the one number 4 is the APDS round. This is a slightly lighter round, but it goes very, very fast, and that's what will punch a hole through anything. However, that's assumed you can hit it, and the early versions of Sabo were unreliable and not accurate, and the guidance is not shown. I think off the top of my head, around about 450 yards. You shouldn't engage beyond that and expect to hit it with a Sabo round. So this is something, if you met a King Tiger or something else, that's the kind of circumstance you're expected to use one of those. The main ammunition is this one here, number 5. Armor piercing capped ballistic cap. So it's got an armor piercing cap, which is sort of stubby cap that helps it get a grip and punch into the armor, but it has a ballistic cap to improve the ballistics of the round as it goes through the air. And number 6 is the armor piercing capped, and number 7 is the straightforward AP, nothing clever about it. Number 8 is there's a practice round, and number 9's the high explosive. And on the left shows some of the markings of the different high explosive round. This is from the user manual. And what you have is a reduced charge for the high explosive round. This is a fixed ammunition type, and they have a high. The standard HE was okay, but the comments during the first use of it was that the high explosive round was not as good as the 75mm round from an ordinary Sherman, so they start issuing a high capacity round. And I think the Shell HE HCT Mark 1, I think, means a high capacity with tracer fitted Mark 1. Somebody can correct me. I'm sure I'm not an expert on the ammunition, but this is that's the ammunition that's used with this equipment. And so even from the very beginning, the assumption is you might not be engaging armor all the time. There's an HE round for engaging soft targets. The Administrative History of the 21st Army Group says the gunners are expected to fire about 1 HE round a day and about 6 AP rounds, or APC-BC rounds. There is no annual special allocation of the 21st Army Group for the discarding Sabo. I think this is issued as a special, via a special method, and under tight control from HQRA at Army level. For example, I know that the 6-pounders used the discarding Sabo in a battle on the 1st of July 1944, and the one of the battery commanders of the Suffolk Yeomanry, 55th RA, says this was absolutely brilliant. The Sabo was absolutely brilliant stuff, but we never saw it again. So it obviously not easy to recover it. Now, this stuff here, this is some of the facts and figures about the ammunition. You can get this off the internet quite easily. Notice that the complete round, the weight, you can say the 17-pounder is the weight. 17 pounds is what the APC-BC round weighs. The APDS round weighs 7 pounds. And you'll notice going across, there's the HE reduced, HE hypercapacity reduced charge. I'm not quite what that HE super HC reduced is. I don't know. The only difference seems to be it has a percussion, or recording this as a percussion. What I find is slightly weird is they have a smoke round, and I'm not sure how an anti-tank unit uses a smoke round with time. I'm not sure who has the firing tables for that, but they must have some. I haven't seen them. But you have a base ejecting smoke round and a base ejecting coloured smoke round. Whether that's in World War II or afterwards, I don't know. I couldn't see it. I'm not seeing any use of smoke screening stuff in the war. That may be something that the Royal Armoured Corps played with after the war. Also notice down as you come down, look at the on the left hand side, close to the bottom, it says weights, propellant weights, and you can see the weights of the propellant, lots of propellant being used for the AP and APDS, and then you're using about a sixth of that weight of propellant for the high explosive. And the impact also there, if you look down muzzle velocities, you can see that the muzzle velocity is really quite high on the super high on the APC and the APDS. And you can see underneath it the effects on barrel wear and so on. But you can get all that off the internet, should you wish. I do now. Oh, that's it. Let's look at this. This is the layout inside. This is what it looks like. Again, this is from the user handbook. I think the one thing I couldn't see exactly where it's positioned is the radio, and I think the radio is on the right-hand side opposite the driver's instruments, and I think that's a number 19 set that fits in there. And you can see you've got periscopes and all sorts of storage for loads of things that are in there. And going down, this is what it looks from the left-hand side. This is the layout, and you can see they've adapted the fitting so that whereas the American M10 has a Tommy gun, space for Tommy gun. The 17-pounder has the version has the space for Sten gun. And here it is. This is the drawing again, and this is what it actually looks like. This is from a restored 17-pounder, and this is in nice pristine condition, but bombed up version, ready to go. I'm not going to say anything about this. Oh, I know what I'm going to talk about next. Right, that's the what it looks on the inside. I've cantered through that sort of stuff, but this is a simplified version of the organisation of the people who use the gun, this equipment. This is there are two flavours of anti-tank regiment that the British Army operates in the latter half of the Second World War. You have an anti-tank regiment for a division, which doesn't have any of these self-propelled guns in it, not under normal circumstances. But you then have the anti-tank regiment from an armoured division or a corps anti-tank regiment. And these are the people who get the M10 17-pounders. And what you have is you have 4 batteries in a regiment, and you have 3, and of those 4 batteries, 2 of them have 12 SPs in each, and 2 of them have 12 towed 17-pounders towed by, in the case of a corps anti-rank regiment, the Crusader gun tractor and an armoured division M14 half tracks. This is simplified because I've taken a lot of the supporting vehicles out of it. But you'd also see the regiment's lettered troops from A to L, and those are the troops in the anti-tank regiment. But again, these are for the corps and armoured division anti-tank regiments. This is the structure of an anti-tank battery. This is the second battery, so I've lettered the guns as if they're D, E, and F troops. And you've got quite a chunky battery headquarters here, and that's because the anti-tank batteries are often going to be deployed somewhere on the corps front and nowhere near each other or RHQ. So they're quite well configured to be self-sufficient in administration. So besides a BC, you've effectively got 2 BKs. I'm not sure if they're referred to as BKs, but you have a captain for administration and a captain for quartermaster duties, because the battery may have to be sort of self-sufficient for quite some time. And maybe, for example, in the Normandy campaign, the 2 SP batteries of 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment, one of them was over with the 6th Airborne Division on the east of the Orne, and the other one was with the Canadian Division on the west side of the 1st Corps. So you've got about 20, 30 miles away between each of the between the 2 batteries in the regiment. Note as well that the guns have got 4 guns, and unlike an armoured unit, where the armoured unit will have a troop commander in each commanding the battle from a tank, these are gunners, and the troop commander has a carrier, a universal carrier. There is a big problem with that. It's underpowered and under-armoured, and its mobility is nothing like comparable with that of the M10 going cross-country. And as I've shown on the right here, during the course of the Northwest Europe campaign, they find ways of getting rid of these things and getting them replaced by something which is better armoured. The Crusader anti-aircraft tank's an interesting case. You see lots of photographs of these things because they're sexy. They're part of the Royal Armoured Corps, and every tank regiment had 4 of them with twin 20mm cannon. But these things are actually a menace because A, they have no, apart from the Armoured Corps' aircraft recognition, is also they have no self-destruct round. So what goes up, what goes down, and a very great risk of using these anywhere except into a safe area. And by July 1944, these things are being recalled from the Armoured Corps because they want to use the tank crews to man more gun tanks, and the gunners say yes, please, we'll have those. And one of the uses they use for them are they become the troop commanders' vehicles for corps anti-tank regiments, and this is perfect for in there you're going to be fairly safe against a mortar round, which you're not if you're hit in a universal carrier. I put the Stuart tanks underneath because the Canadians seem to have acquired Stuart M5 Stuart tanks. These are the light reconnaissance tanks. They weren't a lot of use in the Northwest Europe campaign, and so I think they found enough to equip some of their units. Their troop commanders end up with that. I think the BC, the battery commander, doesn't really need a tank. Some of them used it, but otherwise, what they could usefully have was the M3 half tracks, which become a really useful command vehicle and office. That's the M3 is a sort of an armored 1500 weight truck, but it has a track mobility and so on. That's our battery. One thing I will mention is one of the key vehicles, 3 rows down, right-hand side, is the water truck. I mentioned a fellow called John Hall. John Hall was a troop commander of K Battery or K Troop of 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment in the First Corps, lands on D-Day. And in his notes, he reckoned one of the things in the whole of the Normandy campaign, the bravest men were the people who found where the guns were and brought them water, rations, and mail. And at the end of the campaign, they're asked to put forward for people for medals. And they said, I think the guys who drowned the water truck deserved it as much as anybody else. I don't think they got military medals, but that's the vote from the troop commanders, was the fellows who trugged around the battle area finding where these guns were and keeping them in touch with the battery and their families. Right. I'll just show here a little bit of clip of film. So I'm going to change this out. If I can change out what I'm doing. Not sharing that. Here we go. Right, you should see, and I'll just see if we can do. This is some footage of an empty tank, a 17-pounder SCM, a 17-pounder M10 self-propelled gun. There's no audio with this. This is film that's on the Imperial War Museum website, and this is showing the gun being in use in October 1944. You see a massive flash from this thing, a number 1 at the back spotting. Now notice also that they've moved the machine gun from the back, where it's not a lot of use really, to the front where you might make use of it. And this, you can actually see there's enough space in here to actually see what goes on inside when they fire it and so on. There's our lads. These, I think, are from 75th Anti-Tank Regiment of the 11th Armoured Division. And what they're engaging there, according to the War Museum, it's they're engaging the bunkers on the Siegfried Line. Whether or not that was a tactical purpose, something just to line up a photo opportunity to show off their gun, I don't know. But this is, I think, this is what they obviously looked like in battle. Well, that one is at the back. Maybe it's a different gun. Then I think that's a different gun. But this one's got the this has got the .5 caliber at the back. And someone's checking the cartridge ammunition, get the cartridge cases out. And there's one moving around and chugging around a bit. Notice that the gun is traversed the right way around, I think. Yeah, there it is. I would imagine this must be one of the more cooler jobs if you're a gunner, because the number one has quite a lot of responsibility here for tactical positioning, which by and large in a field regiment you're not likely to get, and probably less so, more so than in an anti-tank regiment where your position, or a towed gun where you're told to more or less told this is where your position is or within a bit. And certainly for young officers, this is a fairly cool command, admittedly rather a dangerous one, since your choices are either to command on foot, which is rather dangerous position. Now the wire netting around there is to put some camouflage on that. There was a myth or a belief that the Germans would target the longer barreled 17 pounders before they targeted anything else. Now, let me see if I can stop sharing this. Where are we? So I'm looking for my PowerPoint presentation. I've seemed to have lost it. I don't know where it's gone. Content. What have we got here? Screen. Why is this not working? Sorry, I'm having a bit of a problem here because I can't seem to get back to the PowerPoint. My slideshow is not letting me do that. Presenter mode, share content. Between 7 bits and the Teams Classic chat. Don't want that. There we go. We're back here. Lovely. Okay. Right. Having looked at what the gun looks like and drives around, this is how it was supposed to be used. This is a schematic for defense of a defense of a defense of a division. This is a schematic. And this is kind of based, the template for British Army anti-tank battles are the action at Medellin, where we sort of, the British laid, 8th Army laid a sort of an anti-tank ambush. Notice there are no tanks involved. The idea was that the infantry, and backed by our gunner anti-tank guns, would stop the Germans. By the my layout schematic here shows a division with 2 brigades up and 1 back. And there's a bit more detail about the forward left brigade with 3 battalions in it, and each battalion by 1944 has 6 anti-tank, has a platoon of 6 pounders. But you've also then can be reinforced by the divisional anti-tank regiment, which has 12 guns, 8 17 pounders, and an extra 4 6 pounders. And the idea is that the 6 pounders in the battalion look after themselves and protect the battalion's position, but the divisional anti-tank regiment is largely cited by the anti-tank regiment commanding officer to position these around the killing zones, unexpected routes for armour. And then behind that, if it was a really major threat, you've got the core anti-tank regiments, which have got the 2 towed 17 pounder batteries as a backstop, and you've got to reserve your batteries, 2 batteries of self-propelled guns. So, and the Germans never get close to actually threatening. We never really have to do any of this in Northwest Europe, although they set up systematically defences to protect against the stuff if the Germans do conjure up something. Yeah. Now, partway through the Normandy campaign, they send out the senior instructor of the anti-tank school of artillery, and this was written on a visit to Normandy in July 1944. And the key messages from that are that the first thing is that the 17-pounder is seen as really, really good and deals with anything the Germans bring up. But and it says, and the bit on the screen points out, that casualty has been relatively heavy in anti-tank units, particularly amongst officers, caused mainly by mortar fire, which is brought down very quickly immediately after any objective was captured by the infantry. The reason why the 17-pounder is used so extensively, the self-propelled gun, is for several reasons. The first thing is the unpopularity of the 17-pounder towed equipment. The second is the ineffectiveness of the Sherman and Cromwell and Churchill's 75mm anti-tank guns as against tanks, and also the 17-pounder as being a suitable weapon for offensive operations. It's also comments that it's being used as a tank, and his view is this is wrong in principle, but under the current circumstances it's justified. With the armour, the British armour, there weren't enough 17-pounder tanks for the armour to operate without bit support from self-propelled 17-pounder guns. With the infantry, and by and large with tanks, the tanks take the lead and the 17-pounders follow up in a sort of an overwatch in case they meet up with something they can't otherwise deal with. With the infantry, there's a tendency that the 17-pounder M10 looks like a tank, and from the infantry's point of view, they could use it as a tank, and particularly when they haven't got any tanks, and there's an anti-tank, self-propelled anti-tank gun, people are invited to do just that. And one of the issues here is that you have fairly junior officers assigned as a troop, maybe to support a battalion, and it's quite hard for it's a conversation for a lieutenant to have with a colonel to explain why you know more about the tactics than he does. Again, why John Hall explains on the 8th of July in a battle called Charnwood for Caen. He is having to have this conversation with the commanding officer of a unit this is their first battle, and he has to explain, I've been here since D-Day, and the rule is the armour goes in first before the anti-tank guns goes in, and you can't just sit off and shoot the infantry and you go in before I go in. And the recommendation by the man from Lark Hill is that actually you shouldn't deploy just one troop. You really ought to deploy two troops, and the battery commander does the liaison and discussion about what's going to happen when you've captured an objective. I'll give some examples of how these things actually get used. But there's also a series of requests of how to improve the M10. And the requests were, first of all, could we have some overhead cover? It's very open and exposed, and overhead cover will be really handy. Also some periscopes so that the number one can command the vehicle and have a look out without actually sticking his head out. Oh, and can we have a coaxial machine gun? At which point the man from Lark Hill's view is, why don't we give them a Sherman Firefly and be done with it? And what I'll do now, but he kind of understands why these things are being used, not in the school way, and for good reasons. What they do, incidentally, is some units improvise during the course of the campaign locally manufactured overhead cover. And here's a couple of photographs. This is manufactured, and those units that wanted to have overhead cover by the end of 1944 had some form of overhead cover. There's the complete covered version, and what looks on the right there looks like, I think if that's armour, that looks like a partial cover, which gives some cover to the front, at least covers the gunners, the gunner and loader. The man from Lark Hill also brings forward what the Royal Artillery's solution is to the 17-pounder self-propelled issue, and that is the This is the 17-pounder that on a British version of British tank. This is the 17-pounder mounted on the Valentine tank, which is given a name, the Archer. And they bring one of these over and show them off in July 44 as well. And the verdict of this is from the towed equipment saying, yes, please, anything is better than having a towed 17-pounder gun. The verdict from the people with the M10 self-propelled is whoever saw of a gun that shoots out of its own backside. And this has actually got the gun pointing to the rear, and the left-hand side, that's the driver's visor, and I think the driver has to get out of the way when you use it. One of the comments made by the anti-tank wing senior instructor is, one of the good things about this does not look like a tank. It can't be used as a tank. And so there is an element here of the turf wars coming into play. At the end of the Second World War, the Valentines stay with the gunners, and the M10s end up in the armoured corps. I'm just giving some examples now of some of the actions where these SPs are used. This is possibly a classic example. Here, this is 8th of July, 1944. Top left-hand corner is the outskirts of the city of Caen. And we're advancing roughly north to south. You'll see A and B Troop of 245 Battery of 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment are in support of the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, and they're capturing the village of Buron, which was captured around about the 8 hours, I think, about 8 o'clock, and then they got in there about 9 o'clock. And B Troop was assigned arcs covering south through to southeast, and A Troop covering south through to southwest. 20 to 30 German tanks come into sight, and they knock out 14 of them, which is fairly good. They're under heavy mortar fire all this time as well. Rubble-strewn streets. The tanks are mostly knocked out by two Air Number 1s, Sergeants Bowden and Donovan. The cost of this was 6 self-propels knocked out of the 8, of which 4 were recovered and repaired, 2 officers and 4 other ranks dead, and 6 seriously wounded, and 3 serviceable guns later that day carry on southwards up to the village of Althea. And that's actually, I think, it's quite a typical use of the 17-pounder in its role there, because they would go in and provide the initial anti-tank defence, and then what's coming up behind should be first of all the 6-pounders of the infantry guns, and then of the divisional anti-tank regiment, allowing the SPs to go back into reserve. Notice that both of the troop commanders appear to have been casualties with that. Sergeants Bowden and Donovan both awarded the military medal for that action, and the battery commander, Major Bullivant, gets an MC for it. I couldn't find any other pictures of 245 battery, apart from this one here, which is attributed to one of their guns, which has been knocked out and inspected by some Germans. And I think that's an SS man, judging by his jacket. And you can see the 2 holes punched into the side of the turret. An AP round might go in one side, might go out the other, but it might go through quite a lot of stuff on the way. Notice also at the front of it, you've got 2 road wheels. The only thing that could occasionally go wrong with the M4 chassis was it would shed the rubber after a while. So you see lots of photographs of anything M4, and that includes the M10, has spare wheels strapped to it. And of course, it's got its tow ropes in the event that battery runs flat. There we go. Here's another incident of the sorts of stuff that people got up with. I think this incident happens before the senior instructor's visit. And this is on the same day. This is 8th of July in the Hotos area north of Bayeux, i.e. well away from this attack on Caen. There's Sergeant Todd, a number 1 of an M10 of J Troop of 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment. That's the 30 Corps Anti-Terror Regiment. He's in support of the South Wales Borderers. The infantry withdrew after a counterattack about 20:15 in the evening, leaving Todd all alone, apart from a Sherman tank about 40 yards behind him. When the German infantry, picture on the right, burst through a hedge about 50 yards in front, he engaged them with his Browning, which was mounted on the open turret. He then withdrew through the hedge, drove along the hedge and drove back in again and engaged the Germans in an open field and moved round and up and down the field, causing about 40 casualties before withdrawing, while the Germans were busy trying to chase after him and throw hand grenades in. Although the M10 wasn't a tank, in extremis, it could be very effective in the hands of an aggressive soldier. And Sergeant Todd's action was firmly not met with the approval of anti-tank wing, but it's not a million miles from the deed for which the American hero Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor for an action later in the war. And another one of these, this is an account of and the copy there of the medal citation for Sergeant Smith. Now, Sergeant Smith is from the same regiment, and he is tasked in the morning of the 16th of July. He's supporting an element of the Staffords, North Staffords, who are supposed to be capturing the village of Brettevillette, but they're pinned down in the woods. They're forming up places in the woods to the north of that, on the north edge of the circle there. And they were reduced by heavy casualties of 1 officer and 20 ranks in the company. And they were supposed to be left to reach the objective, which was the village itself. Sergeant Smith should have been remaining behind the infantry and protecting them from tanks. However, he appreciated the attack was likely to fail unless somebody took the lead. He therefore took the lead, advanced 300 yards beyond the objective under heavy machine gun and mortar fire, and from this position he observed 50 Germans who were the main opposition to the infantry advance. He engaged them with HE and small arms fire, and remained in front of the village to enable the infantry to dig in. It wasn't the approved way of using the M10, but his initiative and courage was rewarded with the military medal. And that's kind of the sort of stuff. So, this was an opportunity for gunners to shine on this sort of stuff. This here is an extract from, this is an action where it shows what happens if you don't use the 17-pounder SPs. It comes from a little battle, which on a place called Hills 266, and there's a little map, a sketch map on the top left here. And this is the advance of the route of the Scots Guards, in this case the 3rd Battalion of the Scots Guards of the 6th Armoured Brigade, who were equipped with Churchill tanks. Quite an illustrious bunch, this lot. Amongst their ranks, they include a young officer called Killer Runcie, who will become the Archbishop of Canterbury 40 years onwards. And the second in command of one of the squadrons is a man called Willie Whitelaw, who will become a cabinet minister under Margaret Thatcher. And if you look at the extract from the orders for this 15th Scottish Division orders for Operation Bluecoat, says the towed 17-pounders decided to take on any tanks which might appear of the ridge. The 17-pounders, the self-propelled 17-pounders, were to rendezvous on the start line as soon as the infantry had crossed it and await further orders. And Flowers, whose regiment it is saying, we stood there like country bumpkins watching everybody else go past, and a couple of hours later the Scots Guards find themselves in a rather sticky position because they find themselves where they are ambushed and then stalked by 2 German Jag Panthers, which knock out 14 of the Churchill tanks of, I think it's B Squadron of the Scots Guards, which is a distinct embarrassment. And the comment which Flowers makes is, well, 6 months later, they wouldn't do that. That was the first time they'd been in battle, and nobody knew what to do with the 17-pounders, but they did now. This is quite a popular engagement because the people who like German tanks, this is a war games do all this sort of stuff, and hence it's a wargaming version of the attack. And here's one account here, also another one from Normandy. This is also shows, I particularly like this one because this is one of the great moments of heroism and gallantry and so on. This is an action at a place called Maison-Celle on the 3rd of August 1944, Operation Bluecoat, near a place called Veer. I haven't put a big map to show where it is. But what happens here is that within the area of the Guards Armoured Division, the 153rd Field Regiment, Leicestershire Yeomanry, who are the self-propelled regiment in the Guards Armoured Division, are ordered to occupy a position which they're assured by divisional headquarters is clear of the enemy. However, that's far from the case. Not only were they overlooked by the enemy, but if you look at the map, it shows Maison-Celle on the right-hand side, dug in 75, and shortly afterwards they are engaged by a pack of half a dozen or so Panther tanks with infantry, the of the Leicestershire Yeomanry, knocking out the OP tanks which are on the position, the Shermans there, and destroying 4 SP Sexton 25-pounders, while the Leicestershire Yeomanry make a fighting retreat off to the left. Meanwhile, a call has gone out urgently from the Guards Brigade headquarters. The Brigade commander, General Watkins, says, can we have as many anti-tank guns as quickly as possible to deal with this threat? And Q Sanders Post Battery come charging along, and they've organised themselves slightly different to the way I'd shown configured. They'd basically made 4 troops of 3, one of which was the Battery HQ troop, and they also, even more away from Lark Hill practice, described their vehicles as tanks, and I think the officers command from the SPs. What happens here is that Q Battery turn up, or at least 3, if not more, of the Q Battery guns turn up, and so as the last gun of the Leicestershire Yeomanry is heading off to the left, the Q batteries turn up, and the battery commander, Major Taylor, the Panthers quite difficult to deal with them 10s along the road, the north-south road on the left-hand side of my diagram, and Major Taylor has a go at the first, and personally lays it and misses. The gunner, he then swaps around and the gunner hits the target, and he has another go and he hits one. Unfortunately, Sergeant Major Woolley, his gun was deployed on the wrong side of the hedge, and his is knocked out and burns. And Sergeant Major Woolley and Lance Sergeant Prudo were killed in their own 10s. And one of the curious ones was that evening, Sergeant Farrow of that battery fired 3 rounds at where he thought he could see a Hero tank in an orchard, and he was rewarded by a satisfying explosion. And the next day he confirmed that he destroyed the Panther, but had actually destroyed it through 2 stone walls of a cow byre, and the 17-pounder had gone through the 2 walls of the cow byre and into the side of a Panther tank. Major Taylor and Lieutenant Hawker were awarded the Military Cross. On the right-hand side, I've posted a photograph of an image of the headstone of Sergeant Major Woolley, military medal. He died before he knew he'd been awarded the military medal, and he had been awarded the military medal and promoted to battery sergeant major after one of the actions in the operations called Epsom about the 29th of June, where his citation says that he basically stalked and knocked out what was called a Tiger tank, and then after his troop commander had been wounded, took command of the troop, and he ends up, that's what his military medal's for, but it's not actually awarded and gazetted until a couple of months after his death. But that says this is behind a lot of the graves. They're very serious stories. And this particular story, I think, is something which Q Battery should be very proud, driving around in tanks. I'm just picking up one other action here. This is from the Reichswald. This is an action by 56 Battery Royal Canadian Artillery, and this is the action at the place called the Dammershof in the Reichswald, 11th of February 1945. And this is about the only time I can find where an SP 17-pounder takes on a Jagdpanther. And what's happening here is, if you look at my diagram, you see number 1 shows that the 2nd Battalion Monmouthshares come under fire from a self-propelled gun in the area marked 2, which is the place around a farm complex called the Damershof. Lieutenant Charles Kidd, the troop commander of, I think it's E Troop, advances on foot and his belly to a position where he can see the SP off to a flank. And you can see, if you look carefully at the contours, you'll see it's in a re-entrant. He then leads the M10 to a position where he can engage it from a flank at about 400 yards range. 4 shots hit. Well, I say don't penetrate, but it does knock off the tracks and the vision blocks. And the Jagdpanther crew bail out. And for which Lieutenant Kidd is awarded the Military Cross. And here's the picture. This is Kidd, one of the few people I can find with a photograph of. That's thanks to his employer, the CIBC Bank. On the left, we have Gunner Lurie. I think he's looking at the wreck of the Jagdpanther, may even be the same crew. And on the right here are some of the guns of 56 Battery trundling through the streets of Knokke in Belgium, and you can see they've got the turrets reversed properly to carry that out for long road moves. Here on the right here, this picture here, on the right, you've got a 17-pounder SP. This is from, I think, 196 Battery, is it 296 Battery, of the 91st Royal Artillery Anti-Tank Regiment, and this is them supporting the 6th Guards Armoured Brigade. These are the people who got chewed up by the Jagdpanther in Operation Bluecoat. And the people riding on the tank are paratroopers from the 17th American Airborne Division, and they capture they're off to capture the city of Munster, which many of us who served in BAOR will remember as a base, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why Oxford Barracks becomes the Guards' place. But here, the Guards had obviously learnt their lessons well and kept the battery of self-propelled guns with them quite closely, and they weren't just using them as anti-tank. There wasn't a lot of tank opposition at this point, but they were using them as close support artillery when they needed it, because it was quicker to use their own integral. And I know this is anathema as gunners to admit, but they found having integral or people in support and under command was more useful than having 3 batteries that might respond to them if they could get hold of their FOO. And here's the VE Day. Notice though they've still got their tow chains on the this is VE Day, and I think this is the Canadian Corps, I think. And after the Second World War, we get rid of the M10s. Well, first of all, the gunners, they're given over to the Royal Armoured Corps, who in the sort of turf war claim that they're really a tank. A lot of these are given to other nations. So top left, that's to the Dutch, who got a lot of these when they built up their army. And there's a fair number of these in Belgium, and they may either be Belgian or Dutch ones that have been ended up donated. So the top right-hand one is outside La Roche-en-Ardenne, and the one on the left-hand side, lower left, is outside the Madison Museum at Bastogne. None of these gave any indication that they were originally British equipment. And what's really quite annoying is that the one on the right has a plaque on it showing that this vehicle is painted in the colours of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, which was the tank regiment that was involved in the liberation of La Roche-en-Ardenne, and not the gunner units which are involved in it either. And underneath it, we get a load of those shipped a load to the Middle East, and there's one in the Israeli Museum. The gunners keep these do go across the Armoured Corps, but the Armoured Corps really doesn't like the idea of these things. And to give an example of this, this is if you look at this gun here, my last slide here is, if you look at this gun here, this is this equipment here is called the Charioteer. This was an improvisation or interim when production of the Centurion tank was falling behind production of the 20-pounder, that's an 84mm anti-tank gun. And so the Charioteer was designed, if we were going to have to face the Red Hordes in the late 40s, The solution was to mount the 84mm 20-pounder on the Cromwell tank chassis. It had a very light turret, lightly armoured turret. And basically, if you listen to its features, it's the full checklist of what the crews of the SP M10 17-pounder wanted. It's got a coaxial machine gun, it's got a turret, it's got a periscope, it's got overhead cover, and according to David Fletcher of the Royal Army of the Tank Museum, this is one of the 5 worst British tanks in history. And if you click on his tank chat, you can hear all that. But it may have been a pretty poor tank, but it wasn't a tank. It was, as a tank destroyer, it's exactly what the stuff which the Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments would have said, that's exactly what we want. And so this is kind of the end of the story of the SP 17-pounder. There's plenty of them kicking around. The thing which I find particularly interesting about this is that the way in which different arms, whether it's a culture, there's arms, their doctrine, they see different pieces of equipment in a different way. I've always been impressed as I was researching gunner history in Normandy about how there was, although there's a sense even at the time of how dangerous it was to be in an Allied tank against a German tank, you don't get that sense from the 17-pounder crews, who are probably quite glad that they're not in a towed 17-pounder. Anyway, that's the end of my presentations. Are there any questions?
Frank, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely superb talk delivered with great knowledge and passion. We'll open the floor to questions. So if you want to stop sharing, then we'll get all the faces will appear.
I'll do that.
That
I'll
will
do
be
that if I can find the right. Stop sharing. There we go.
Perfect. So we'll open the floor to questions if people want to raise hands. I'll exercise chairman's privilege, if I may, and ask the first question. And I'm inspired by this question, by the first thing you said about this is also about the men, the people that armed the 17-pounder, but equally what you've just said about the different cultures. So the question is about training. Could you talk a little bit about the training of the detachments, and I suppose it's all about the balance between how much of it is armor training, how much of it is artillery training, because no, it's not a tank, but it's an armored vehicle in a direct fire role. So I'm really keen on where the pendulum sits in terms of training.
Okay, well, we'll look at this history. I mean, there's 2 regiments I've looked at I can look at 7 in some detail, but there's 2 in particular. I mentioned the 91st, who are originally the 5th Argylls, because we started the war with hardly any, not enough anti-tank gunners, and we converted about 20 battalions of infantry into anti-tank and anti-aircraft gunners halfway through the war. So they start out as infantrymen, and the first couple of their years of the war is looking out for defending the beaches of Bridlington, and they are infantry. They then take on 2-pounder, and the 2-pounder, a lot of the training for the 2-pounder equipment, as it is for the German equivalent, is all about manhandling. It's all physical stuff. And you look at photographs, there's whole loads of photographs of people, 2-pounder log racers, effectively, maneuvering over obstacle courses with 2-pounders, and the same with 6-pounders. So they are brought up with the idea you should go forwards with the infantry. The doctrine is never to hunt with the tanks, and unlike tanks, I don't see any training in the area of doing things such as caterpillaring, leapfrogging. This is stuff which you pick up in the field. The SP guns, the 91st, actually take on the 6-pounder and have 6-pounder portees, which they describe as completely useless, and they get bogged down, and you can imagine doing tactical maneuvers with a 4-tonner. The track stuff they do, I don't know how much. And again, they're actually, the doctrine says, and I know they practice moves, but it's typically the doctrine for anti-tank guns, self-propelled or otherwise, it's the same. You're going to go forwards. The battery commander will say, I want you to cover this position. The troop commander will recce the individual sites for individual equipment. And I think a lot of the rest of it, they kind of pick up in the field. And it's, I think the record is quite confusing initially, but it takes several months before they settle down today. This is how they're going to do it. And some of the things they end up doing are very much in the field. For example, the 6th Canadian Royal Canadian Anti-Tank Regiment, they're involved in the operations to clear Walcheren, the island of Walcheren. And there are no tanks there, so they're almost entirely used as assault guns. And they come up with in their the end of their war diary for entry for, I think it's February 1945, a bit earlier than that. They come up with a set of procedures for how do you deploy a self-propelled anti-tank battery in an assault gun role. What liaison do you need? What communications do you need? So this is something they've clearly worked out on the ground, experimentally, and found what works. One of the things which they find which is remarkable, and I don't think I mentioned it in the talk, was that the infantry, they are about the only, the SPs are the only British equipment which mounts a .2 Mardus 50 caliber. And they also, the infantry, this is absolutely brilliant. Can we have some more of these? And they're used as much as they're valued for the heavy machine gun fire they can bring as much as anything else. So I think a lot of it is it's tactical evolution in the field. I don't know if that helps somebody answer, or I just bluffed there.
No, it's really good, Frank. Thank you very much. Can I invite questions from the floor, please? Any questions? Patrick Garnett, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. As a field gunner, I was rather dazzled by the length of the barrels on these anti-tank guns. I mean, 55 calibers, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas I spent most of my service on things like the 75mm pack howitzer, the American one, and the Italian 105 pack howitzer. I was on the trials detachment for that. And they've got 14 calibers length, which is an enormous difference. The 25-pounder, I think, has 26 calibers. And that's a sort of in between the howitzer and the anti-tank gun. But what are the magic numbers for this? I mean, is it really about the weight of mule top loads, or is there some technical reason, possibly the amount of propeller required, that separates these guns?
I think this is I think that's a question for instructor in gunnery rather than me. But I'll have a go. During the course of the war, they all end up with longer and longer barrels. So, but there is obviously a science to it. You've got to get a propellant that actually works, and you've got to get, there is a limit. That you've got to limit things like the size and weight of the barrel. The German guns of this era, things like the Jagdpanther, they're enormously front heavy, which actually damages the suspension of the vehicle. There's a limit to how long a barrel you can make and where you can actually position it. The British, though, end up by saying, well, we're going to stay with the gun as it is, and we'll get the extra punch through discarding sabot and having clever ammunition. And that actually is the way I think that's happened from the end of the war onwards. But I think that's a question for someone with more knowledge and experience on technical gunnery than me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Any more questions from the floor, ladies and gentlemen? Perfect. On that basis, Frank, on behalf of the Royal Artillery Historical Society, thank you for an absolutely fascinating lecture, replete with knowledge, with enthusiasm. I think we haven't had a technical lecture for some time, and so actually this has been really refreshing. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you either electronically or physically to show your appreciation for Major Frank Baldwin. Frank, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, perfect. Well, I'll just little look to the future. Our next webinar is the 20th of February, Major Mark Martin, looking at Frederick Miller VC. Then we project through to late April with a presence meeting in Lark Hill. And I note that the call has gone out for the Portsmouth Battlefield Tour at the end of September. So we've got some excellent stuff in the pipeline, and many thanks to our programmer, Michael Phillips. Just as a final, by the way, there's a couple of podcasts out there, or you can find them on YouTube, from our regimental historian, Dr. Spencer Jones. Just a couple to note. He does a very good First World War podcast with a chap called Dan Hill, called Not So Quiet on the Western Front. It's very, very listenable, so I do encourage it. And also he's teamed up for something called Military History Plus with Professor Gary Sheffield. That's about much more than the First World War, but again, both these are very, very listenable, and I do recommend them. So Frank, once again, many thanks indeed for presenting for the first webinar of 2024. And ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.